Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to Brainstorm Tech. For Dan and Howard, welcome to the Brainstorm Tech stage.
Thank you.
I think this is a great topic. Hopefully our conversation will be out of this world. All right, sorry about that. This is a topic which I've actually been fascinated for my whole life. Maybe many of you have too. This is meet our fourth silent panelist, Major Matt Mason. I was obsessed with this toy when I was a little boy and all about space, so I think our two panelists also were. Dan, you're the CEO of Virgin Orbit. Tell us a little about how you first got interested in space when you were a boy.
First got into space. Well, let's see. It was the summer of 1969. My parents made me stay up really late one night. I was in New York, and we watched a very grainy picture of the first men, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, on the moon. That really kind of struck a chord, all the excitement in the house, all the excitement in the neighborhood. The next morning, the New York Times came, and it was all space, the whole edition. And as a matter of fact, I still have that paper in my house, and it's a little worn, but still fun to read.
Howard, you are the CEO of Maxar Technologies, also a person who's long been working in the space area. What were some of your first memories?
Well, we're both old enough to remember that 1969 landing. Many in the room here probably aren't. But it captivated, I think, the attention of the whole world at the time. And then I spent 10 years living on the Space Coast, as it's called, in this Cape Canaveral area. And you're surrounded by people that have spent their whole careers dealing with space. You're watching launches. It kind of gets in your blood. And I think what we're seeing now, from our view, is kind of a new space renaissance because of the capabilities of what companies can do in space, and I think it's a very exciting time.
Yeah. Great, thank you. Dan, you spent about 30 years at Boeing before you went to Virgin. You actually worked on a space plane, not just like my toy Matt Mason space plane. But then
Didn't have that really neat suit, though.
All right, that's true. Richard Branson somehow convinced you to come over and do this Virgin Orbit thing. Tell me a little about why you joined the company and what are you doing?
Well, it's a really exciting time in space, as Howard just mentioned. Space is going through a transformation, and we see it in the press, we see it in the technology that's being brought to bear. And so, sitting over the years, you see these new enterprises popping up. As Howard mentioned, having space in your blood, you're always ready to jump in. And so small satellites are now a really major move in the industry. So satellites that used to be the size of small buses or cars are now the size of a washing machine or a refrigerator. And what that's opened up is a whole new economy for space. And so you see companies working to put satellites into low Earth orbit. Virgin Orbit is a company that is designed to provide the transportation for those satellites. So we're building a small satellite launcher that actually flies up from under the wing of a 747 aircraft and is released and then ignites and takes the satellite to orbit.
So it's not like the old Cape Canaveral.
Right. This comes off a runway. I mean, a lot of the holy grail in launch has been how do we get to aircraft-like operations? And so when Richard came to me and said, we have this project and we'd like to stand up a company and we'd like you to lead it, there was no answer but yes. I mean, my blood was just pumping.
Got it. Howard, Maxar is a little different. You have sort of brought together a lot of different pieces of the satellite business, almost like a one-stop shop. Tell me a little about what's the vision there.
Well, our vision as a leading commercial space company is to try and provide end-to-end solutions. So we make communication satellites. If you've ever watched DirecTV or listened to Sirius XM, those are our satellites providing that content delivery. We are the leader in Earth imagery. So whether you use Google Maps or Uber, our data from the images are providing the backbone for the mapping capabilities. And then if you've ever watched the SpaceX Dragon capsule deliver cargo to the International Space Station, our robotics on the space station are providing all of that capability. So it's really been all about connecting an end-to-end solution. And then the last mile, that's the latest investment, is utilizing various machine learning and artificial intelligence algorithms to take the imagery and to even know more about the planet as a result of that.
I wanted to follow up a little. I know you guys have a lot of satellites that watch us from up high. There's something coming up called Worldview Legion that's going to have this incredible 30-centimeter resolution. What's that going to be for? Should people be worried at all that you can read what I'm walking down the street with?
Well, it's not quite that capable, but it is the difference between, do you want to look at a building, or do you want to look at a ship perhaps that does not have its transponder on, that's approaching the coastline and see the markings on the ship, see the name of the ship. That's what you can do with 30-centimeter imaging. And so there's a lot of talk these days about small satellites, and certainly satellites have become more cost-effective. Launch costs are becoming much more cost-effective, and that is driving a lot of the investment in the economy. But it still has to do with what you want to do with the satellite and what's the capability.
Got it. Dan, one of the projects that your company is working with, we had SoftBank here yesterday, is their OneWeb, which is this idea that there are going to be 900 satellites circling the Earth and giving internet access anywhere in the world, I think. But this has been tried so many times before. There was Teledisk, there are a lot of other ideas. What's going on with OneWeb, and is it really going to work this time?
Well, what's going on in general in small satellites, first of all, is technology has really changed the game. So, with the functionality that you all have in your iPhones or cell phones is an example. I mean, a satellite is a box of electronics with a propulsion system. So you can imagine what's happened in the last 10, 15 years with satellites. The functionality has increased tremendously. Technology in propulsion has increased tremendously. Electric propulsion, ion propulsion, which used to be science fiction, is now standard. And communication capabilities, phased arrays, and even laser communications is now something we use in space. So there's been huge advances in technology. That's allowing concepts like OneWeb and some of the other constellations to go from the drawing board to reality. And low Earth orbit is more complicated because you have satellites. Instead of when you're geosynchronous, you have a satellite and you're watching it all the time in the same spot from the Earth. In low Earth orbit, they're always moving. Well, the other thing that's really improved, and the other breakthrough, is just computer capability on the ground, and how to control and communicate with lots of different objects is now just like falling off a log. I mean, we have great technology. You put that together, and now you can make a OneWeb a reality.
And has it started going up yet, or what's the schedule?
No, they're planning launches starting later this year.
Okay, got it. Howard, I know you made like the DirecTV satellite, and it's sort of, in a way, an old-fashioned thing. What are some of the newer companies that are coming to you and looking to put stuff up in space?
Well, I think in addition to the communications part that Dan already talked about, it's all about sensors in space. So companies that are putting different kinds of sensing capabilities, in our case, it's either very highly capable optical or radar payloads. But you have companies that are putting up satellites that will track the AIS signal, which is what all ships produce, track airplane transponders for location. They're tracking various RF signals. They're monitoring greenhouse gases. So it's all about sensors, on the payloads that are going up in these satellites, and then what that combined with the advanced computing capabilities, what that can tell you about the mission that you're undertaking.
So at some point, when Malaysia Airlines, when that plane disappeared, if we had satellites, we could have known maybe where it was.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So the technology is not the barrier. The barrier is what's the business case for these various investments, and how long does it take, to pay off? Because building satellites, even small ones, is not something that you do in a month or two. These are still multi-year projects. And so you have the build cycle, you have the launch and deployment cycle, and then if you have the right business case, then you get cash flow. So it does require investors that do have, a bit of a longer term timeline rather than, a year or two.
I mean, I know we have a lot of traditional venture capital investors in our audience today. I was at an MIT space conference last year, and one of the big complaints from a lot of the startups was that the model of this many years of building satellites didn't really fit with the typical VC timeline. You spent some years in private equity. I'm wondering, do you feel like there is starting to be more of an investor class with capital to back these kind of companies?
Well, I think so. We see billions of dollars going into the space market. It's a much higher level than it was 5 years ago. And I think there is certainly an appetite for investment, but it does take a fund that is going to think about more of a 5 to 7 year return rather than expecting from day one to do that in 2 or 3 years. So it's going to take investors that have a little different timeline, I think.
Dan, what's your view of the investing environment?
No, I think that's right. There's a huge amount of money coming into the system, especially in some of these new areas. The small satellites and the lower cost to produce them is generating huge interest and excitement. 20 years ago, if you wanted to put a satellite in orbit, you probably needed capital of around $300–400 million to get capability into space, and a long tail.
Right.
Today, it's a tenth or less of that to get capability in space. And there, as Howard said, it depends upon the mission and the business case. So that's lowering the bar, and so we have lots of new entrants from different companies, new ideas, businesses that want to monitor different aspects of the economy, the environment. It's really an exciting time to be in the space market.
Space used to be the domain of governments.
Yeah.
Well, that's actually...
And it certainly still is, but today the commercial space market is growing at a very high rate.
Well, that's my exact follow-up. I wanted to ask both of you, do you feel like the government climate in the United States and elsewhere in the world is welcoming to commercialization, or are there still a lot of hurdles?
There's quite a bit of welcoming. There's still, I think, work to do to figure out exactly how government utilizes all of the commercial products. And so there's definitely still work to do. But from all the various users in the government, you hear a pretty consistent message that we like the fact that private industry is investing, and we want to make use of those platforms and those services.
Howard, your company is involved with a lot of government contracts, but so how do you see it right now breaking down between private, commercial, and government, and where do you see that going? About
half of our revenue is U.S. and international governments, and about half is commercial. So we're very committed to the commercial part. It's the fastest growing. Applications by tech companies using especially the imagery that we produce. New use cases are being introduced every day. So that's the faster growing part of the business. But the stable tenet, if you will, is U.S. and foreign governments. And so it's an interesting relationship. They're enabling the investments that we make up front, because it takes a while to get the payback, but yet they're also benefiting from the scale economies brought by the commercial customers. So the attitude is definitely there, but governments don't give up control easily. They're used to designing and having everything under their control, and they're still, I think, in a transition, getting used to buying commercial capabilities, certainly in space. Dan, do you agree? Is it moving in that direction for your business as well?
Yeah, I think that's right. There's a desire in the government to be as agile as the private sector and to shorten development timelines, to take more risks, but there's a whole cultural progression that they have to go through. And again, the vision, I think, we see coming through, but it's got to really go through all the way down to the requirements and how the contracts are written and how we do our work. Requires a lot of patience in our companies to break through those cycles of kind of the prior way that they have bought things. I mean, U.S. government used to pay contractors to design computers. Right. Finally, they're not doing that anymore. They're buying those. And I think there is definitely an attitude that if there's a commercial business model that justifies private investment, let's take advantage of that. And certainly in the imagery area and increasingly in the communications area, they're putting up fewer of their own satellites and buying more and more commercial imagery and commercial communications. I'm going to come to the audience for questions in a few minutes. I have a couple more, so get ready if you have your major Matt Mason question. We're going to have microphones circulating. As Andrew mentioned before we came out, the president made news a few months ago saying he wanted to form a space force as another war fight and create space as another war-fighting domain.
I think space has largely avoided the battlefield thus far, and some people have expressed concerns that maybe that gets in the way of commercial satellites. I'm interested for both of your point of view, if you have one, on the Space Force.
Well, I'll say a few words here. Number one is the discussion of how, well, number one is space is and has been central to our national security for many, many years. And so communication satellites, guidance and navigation, imagery has all been really, really important, and our armed forces can't do what they do without space, and I think that's universally acknowledged. The question that's really been out, and this has been a question in debate for several years. I mean, I was on a panel 4 or 5 years ago where how should the government organize for space was discussed, so this is not brand new. So the real question that's been brought out is how should government organize to best apply focus and plan budgets and put the capital in space that's needed. And then, and I'm not an expert on government organization, and so it's going to be a question of, focus versus not having too much bureaucracy, and that's where the debate is. I will say the other thing that's happened over the last few years is, 2007, China demonstrated an anti-satellite weapon. There's been a lot in the news about what the Russians are doing. There's dozens of space agencies now across the world. And so the question of how do we protect and how do we keep a peaceful space environment is a very, very important question. And there's a number of solutions to that. And certainly part of it is making the cost of developing anti-satellite weapons and defeating our systems too expensive and low value, and maybe because you can replace them quickly, or because the adversary doesn't get a benefit. So there's a whole host of discussions that really need to take place. And whether the Space Force is the right one or some other organization, I'll leave that to folks in the Beltway.
Got it. Howard, on the flip side, today Jeff Bezos' Blue Origin is launching a test of their New Shepard rocket, which is actually eventually designed to take people, ordinary people, into space, possibly. Today it's just going up with what a dummy they call Mannequin Skywalker. But help us, pull back the lens a little bit and help us understand how is space going to happen for human transportation.
Well, I think the dimensions of space, as you think about exploration, that's probably what most people think about and you read about with regard to the new capabilities and building a lunar gateway, going to Mars, going to other interplanetary. I mean, all that is, to me, as an individual, fascinating. It's kind of longer term in terms of
how long is longer term? 50 years, 20 years?
I certainly don't think 50 years. I think in 20 years, you're going to see space commerce in a totally different way than today. I mean, a lot of individuals today don't think about how they interact on a regular basis with technologies in orbit. And it just happens, behind the scenes. So that's going to continue, and as the costs go down, the launch costs, the capabilities of the technologies, you're going to see continued expansion. We're funding right now a special satellite that will be able to assemble other satellites on orbit.
In space.
So we'll be able to use our robotics to assemble satellites, to refuel satellites that are running out of fuel, to repair damage to satellites. And these are things today that you do see in the movies, but aren't actually happening on a regular basis. But that's here and now. We'll be launching that in this program with the U.S. government in 3 years. And so certainly in 20 years, my vision of what's going on in orbit, as well as potentially at least on the moon, is pretty dynamic.
Okay, very cool. All right, let's go to the audience. There's people walking around with microphones. Let's go over here. Please just stand up and say your name.
Sure, Chris Shalakis with Nomura. I know there's a lot of space in space, but low Earth orbit seems to be getting crowded already. I'm wondering, as all these other assets get deployed, who governs that? It used to be the risk was on launch. Now things are at risk in orbit. So,
great question.
We share your concern and are strongly encouraging U.S. and international governments to deal with that in the same way they deal with control of the aerospace, in the atmosphere through the FAA in collaboration with their partners around the world. So we definitely think that's real. We've had our satellites in orbit damaged, and it's only going to get worse, not better.
Yeah, the Secretary of Commerce came forward pretty recently and picked up the gauntlet to do space traffic control, which will be a first step. The Air Force has been very active in that, but it really needs a civilian infrastructure because of the amount of public activity going on there. The other thing I think that will actually become a reality, it's been talked about a lot over the years, is debris mitigation. Now, there are rules that we live by about how long objects need to be in space and where they should go once they're done with their life, but also active debris retrieval or deorbit I think is going to be something real that we see over the next few years, and there are a number of companies chasing that.
So that's a job for the future, space trash collector.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely.
All right, let's go. We have a question back here. Please stand up and say your name.
Thank you. I'm Ben Narrison from New Enterprise Associates. You mentioned that satellites have moved from sort of the size of a bus to the size of a refrigerator, and over the last couple of years I've seen several smart entrepreneurs, they're doing really small satellites, and they're able to sort of optimize around the remnant space in the launch vehicles as more and more launch vehicles have occurred. And so the two questions are, one, how are you thinking about these ultra small units that are getting into space and the business around that? And two, do you believe that over time, even in the next 2 to 5 years, that remnant space, because of the disconnect between the size of what goes into space and the free areas around it, disappears and the economics of that change dramatically and change those businesses?
Thank you.
Well, certainly, satellites can be as small as a loaf of bread and with real functionality. And so we in our launch planning, some of our plans are for a single satellite the size of a refrigerator. Other missions that we're planning currently have numerous of these small satellites that go up. And it's really dependent upon how much power, what kind of resolution is needed, and what kind of apertures.
Howard, do you want
to? The other aspect is how long you want it to last. So you put a CubeSat up, it has no ability to maneuver. It's probably not using radiation-hardened components. So it's very, very low cost. It can do a few things, but it's going to last 6 months or 12 months. So I think there's going to continue to be the whole range of literally, we make $5 million satellites, we make $500 million satellites. And they both today have a place. Whether the 500 will ever totally go away and go to the lower end, I think depends on the technology. But there's definitely, the movement is smaller, and that's why launch capabilities like Virgin Orbit are going to be successful, because you're not going to need the power that exists in these very, very large rockets. I find it interesting that there are companies developing larger, heavier payload capabilities, and then some at the other end of the extreme. So I think it just shows the diversification today in the market. But there's no question, as costs come down, the investment thesis is better and business cases close. So again, I think investment will continue to flow into various space commercial enterprises because of that.
We're almost out of time, so I want you both of you to just give me a quick reality check. Morgan Stanley last year published a widely circulated report saying that the space economy could triple in 20 years and be $1 trillion market. So Howard and Dan, we just have like 30 seconds, but is that going to happen?
I think that's very much in the realm of possibility. I mean, our thirst for data and our thirst for information globally is just growing by leaps and bounds. So when my kids are in running companies, their expectation of how quickly they get their three-dimensional VR is going to be instant.
Howard, what do you think?
Anything that is global can be done better, quicker, more effectively from space.
All right.
So I agree, it's going to be a big market.
All right, well, we'll talk about it probably next year at Brainstorm Tech. Thank you very much. Let's thank our panelists.